Right, so for those who don't know me, my name is Nick Randolph. You might have seen me jump up this morning and talk about the fact that I was doing a couple of sessions. I saw a disappointing number of about 6 people rock up to the exam cram, so I'm assuming that you guys all know what you're doing and that you don't need to sit this cert. So if you want more after this session, I've got another 2 tomorrow, so there's plenty more Windows Phone stuff still to come. This afternoon, we're really going to be focusing on, I guess, not just the fundamentals of doing Windows Phone, so this is not a 101 session, but equally well, we're not going to cover anything particularly complex. It's really about pointing out some tools and techniques that you can use as part of being a Windows Phone developer that might make your life a little bit easier. So this is kind of backed on just a couple of years worth of experience writing Windows Phone stuff. So what you'll see is the way that I approach things is I'll point out frameworks. The examples I use won't be the frameworks that I don't use, because well, I don't use them. So I'll be focusing on the stuff that I do use. So if you've got questions as we go through, feel free to stick your hand up and say, hey, I don't agree with that, or what about this? I'm sure I probably will have an answer as to why I don't do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the audience shouldn't do that as well. So stick your hand up, ask questions. Let's make this a little bit more interactive rather than me saying you should do this, you should do this, you should do this, and you go, Okay, so it's two-way conversation. Right, so the session, this is the grand total of the agenda. So it's a bunch of stuff that's going to make, hopefully, your Windows Phone app development that much quicker, and hopefully you'll end up with more robust code. And potentially you'll have code that you can not only do Windows Phone, but also Windows 8, and potentially other platforms if you so desire. Right, let's kick things off. So project templates that come out of the box with Visual Studio, there's quite a few of them. Most of them you can just, right, don't use them. Okay, the reason that they're there is to basically guide you and to basically say that there's a number of different things that you should be aware of, like the panorama and the pivot. Right? So if you've never worked with those are great sample solutions that you should go and open, take a look at what they do, take a look at how the panorama works, how the pivot works, put that to one side as if it was a prototype, and start your project afresh, okay? And in fact, what we'll do in a minute is actually we're going to take the Windows Phone app and we're going to clear out a whole bunch of rubbish that you don't actually need, okay? The reason you do that is basically, if you leave that stuff in there, I guarantee you'll ship your app with that stuff in it because you won't get rid of it, right? And it's not that it's bad, it adds a little bit of size, but it's just stuff that gets in your way. It's stuff that shouldn't be there, it's stuff that you don't need, okay? Unless you happen to be building international applications, in which case that's great sample code. A lot of us won't start that way, okay? If you need to go down that way eventually, you'll go back and you'll look at MSDN and you go, okay, that's how I do internationalization, that's how I do resources and those types of things. For most of us, if we're building English language apps to start with, we won't need that stuff, okay? So we're going to do a bunch of that stuff in a minute. I do want to highlight that there are a couple of new additions to this, if you didn't see them sneak this one in. In Update 2, they actually sneaked in a Windows Phone unit test app. Okay, so we now have unit testing support for Windows Phone, which is really quite cute. The problem is it doesn't actually work in the cloud. So if you're using TFS in the cloud and you're trying to get tests to work, unfortunately that test project doesn't work. What we'll talk about later on when we talk about testing in TFS, so I'll show you how to use portable class libraries, and then how you can use basically just any other test, like a test app, to basically test that code, which will then run in the cloud. So this one's really good though for testing stuff that you actually want to test your code running on either the emulator or a device, because essentially what it does is it spins up an app and actually runs your code as if it was running on the device, okay? Okay, solution structure. So this is some of the stuff that you get out of the box when you create one of these sample projects, or one of these projects by default. So you can see there that I've expanded out all of the folders there, and you can see that they generate tiles for both the flip and the iconic tiles. So remembering in Windows Phone 8 we now have 3 different sizes, and we've got 3 different tile templates. So we've got iconic, flip, and we've got a cyclic tile template. They actually give you sample tiles for all for those different types, and then they give you this alignment grid, which most of us would have never used, and then we have this application icon, which of course we need. So of those, we can basically start to cull out some of the images. That saves us a little bit of space. Going further down, we've got resources. So we've got an app resources and package. And actually, what you don't realize is that that's actually closely tied with the localized strings that is down there. Again, if you're not internationalizing your app, you can get rid of that stuff. Okay, it's just adding stuff that's going to get in your way. Okay. So let's just flip over, and we're going to do quite a few demos today. So I'm going to start off with a brand new project. So Windows Phone project. I've already filled in the stuff, and we're going to go OK. We still get the dialog to switch between phone 8, phone 7. We're going to go phone 8 today. And here we go. Get ready with the delete key. Right. So let's go into our tiles, right? So we do need to have some default tiles there, because obviously if somebody goes pin my application to start screen, you actually want a tile to display there. And so we're going to leave the medium and small tile. I'm going to get rid of the large, because I'm not going to support that. I'm going to get rid of the iconics. And this alignment grid, if I hover over there, you'll see that it's basically a set of red squares. This is particularly good if you're not particularly visually acute and don't realize that things need to be in a straight line for Windows Phone. There's some code actually in the main page, the XAML on the main page. If I scroll down to here, you can uncomment this line down at the bottom here. And what they'll do is it'll actually overlay this grid over your page, and so you can see where things are aligning or where things aren't aligning. Okay, so if you don't have a designer on board and you basically want to make sure that you do have things in line, leave the grid in there. Basically use it from time to time to check that you have alignment on all of your items in there. Okay. Yep.
Could you set that to build as debug only?
You potentially could if you wanted to spend time hacking your MS build file or your project file. That's definitely a great option. To be honest, I never use it, so I just get rid of it. So.
If you're going to do it that way, you probably have the image there, visibility set to invisible, then just have in your code behind one line of hash if debug visibility.show.
Yes, so yeah, definitely. That's a good point. So if you do enable this by chance, and Dave's point is basically, you want to make sure that at runtime, like when you go to release, you're not going to release a version with the grids on it. So you want to make sure that in your code behind, you basically have a statement that's got hash if define or hash if debug, show it, and hash end if. That way you make sure when you do a release build, you never see it. It's a good tip there, Dave. Right, so let me go and delete these items like so. Okay. And while I'm at it, I'm going to cull out some of this. I'm actually going to leave the resources folder, so we're going to come back to that in a minute. Now, the other thing I don't like is the fact that they put main page actually in the root folder. And it's like, by the time you end up with a project that's got 10, 15, 20 pages or something, you're going to end up with a really long project there. And by the time you've got other entities and view models and all of that stuff that goes with it, it's going to be a really, really monolithic kind of solution structure. So let me just break this out a little bit. So we're going to go add folder. Pages, and I know that people call them pages or views or whatever. It doesn't actually make much difference, so let me move that to there. And you're all going to go, this is going to break and go horribly wrong in a minute. And if I don't remember to do something, it will. While I'm here, I'm going to add another item because we'll come back and do a second page a bit later on. So I'll add second page in there. And I'll move that into there as well. Right, so the thing that's going to go wrong is obviously if I try and run it now, it's going to go pear-shaped because it's going to go, hey, didn't you just move that file? And Visual Studio is not quick enough to realize that, okay, well, I could just go and update the manifest file and point you to that file instead. But I've got an alternate way of doing that. So number one option, go into your manifest file and basically put a prefix slash pages in there. Okay, so that's going to redirect it to the correct main page or the correct location. The problem is, if I come back later and say, actually, well, the team doesn't really like the term pages, it likes views, okay? It means that in here, I've got to change it from pages to views, and that's okay. But if every navigation that I've got through my app relies on /pages, I'm going to have to go through and replace that in every single place where I've got a navigation, okay? So what we can do is actually, in our app.xaml, we can come in here and put a URI mapper. So let me just drop that in. Okay, so what this is doing, and actually you can ignore the first one. The first one's there actually because if you use third-party components, so for example, the Windows Phone Toolkit, it's got some pages actually as part of that toolkit. So for example, the date time picker goes into a separate page. Okay, if you don't have that line in there and you start to rewrite your URIs, okay, it's going to balk and say, hey, you're redirecting me to a different page that doesn't actually exist. Okay, so the first one basically picks up that you're referring to a page that's in a different assembly, and it actually rewrites to the same URL. Okay, so basically it gets caught on the first one and doesn't go through to the second one. What the second one's going to do is basically if I'm going to navigate to mainpage.xaml, it's actually redirecting me to /pages /mainpage.xaml. So for example, if I wanted to change it now to a views folder, I could simply change that to views. And my mouse is getting in the way of that. to views. And all of a sudden, every single navigation I've got through my app, boom, straight across to views. Okay, so it's really convenient from that. Now, the URI mapper itself is not very great if I just define it in the resources, okay, for my application. I actually need to wire it into my app. So let me go into app.xaml.cs and let me just find where my frame's defined. And all I need to do here is basically say URI mapper equals resources URI mapper as URI mapper. Okay, so at startup, my application is basically going to get this URI mapper, and it means that every navigation that I do thereafter is going to get rerouted. That all make sense? Let's give it a whirl. Okay, so I've got some build errors because I deleted some stuff. Let me just go and delete that. Just out of interest, how many people here use ReSharper? Okay, good percentage. How many people use another refactoring tool? How many people don't use a refactoring tool other than what's in Visual Studio? Okay, I used to be in your bucket. I used to be a big advocate of not having anything other than Visual Studio. And the reason I did, I was doing a lot of presenting. And the reason I didn't want anything like ReSharper is because I'd become dependent on it. And I'm unfortunately in that boat. I cannot pick up somebody's laptop who's got Visual Studio and just start coding, because all I do is press Alt-Enter, 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 and I'm going, why is it not working? Then I go Control-Dot, and hopefully Visual Studio itself's got the refactoring tool I want. Okay. If you're not already using a refactoring tool, I highly recommend it, because most of my demos, or the code that I'm writing today, you'll notice that as I go through, these hints are coming up, and probably before you even see them, I'm pressing Alt-Enter because I know that that hint's coming, and so that I'm applying those hints as I go through, so it's just going to help me refactor my code. So you can see here that there's things like this resource isn't used. Alt-Enter. Boom, get rid of it, okay? Clean up your code as you go through. If you see something dimmed out like this, get rid of it, okay? The biggest thing you can do to tidy up your code is delete code, okay? If it's not being used, prompt yourself and say, okay, why is this not being used? I can't count the number of times I've seen a developer who will do a build and see 100-odd warnings in their build output. Why are those warnings there, okay? If you're not continuously going through and getting out those warnings, then you're not doing your job, okay? You need to be refactoring your code, and getting rid of warnings is one of those things, okay? So whether it be warnings from ReSharp and basically saying, hey, you could get rid of this, or you can clean up this, or it being Visual Studio saying that there's a build warning, you should be going through and cleaning those up. Even if it's a matter of just putting the pragma statements there to basically say, yeah, you can safely ignore that one. It means that you've actively made a decision to ignore that warning, as opposed to just going, I know that there's 50 build errors, okay, I'm just going to ignore them. Right, now that I've got off my soapbox, let's fix the rest of these errors. Okay, so the other thing, because I got rid of those resources, there's also a big chunk in the app.xaml.cs around initializing for foreign languages. Get rid of that. Okay. If you do think you're going to be doing internationalization, you can comment the code out instead of deleting it. Let me just get rid of this up here. Okay, we should be good to run. Ta-da! Okay, all of that just to see main page. Okay, the point being is that we've cleaned out a lot of code. Okay, we've added the improvement of having a subfolder there that we can host our pages in, and it means that we've got some flexibility in terms of how we restructure our code or refactor our code as we go forward. Okay, so for those people who have built phone apps, how many people have coded for the light and the dark theme? Okay. This came as quite an interesting concept that Microsoft started to push out, and they basically said, okay, Windows Phone's going to have these options for the user, and they basically are dark theme, light theme, and an accent color. And conceptually, it's a great idea. I mean, it's good to give the user some choice, and it's even better if the app developers out there are able to adopt those themes and apply them through their app, because that means that the user can say, okay, well, I like the dark theme, so I like having a black background and some white text. Or, alternatively, white background, black text, okay, depending on what kind of mood you're in, right? And it'd be really good if the apps that I built sort of married in with the platform and actually took advantage of those, okay? That's great, okay, I can handle that. The accent color is a little bit of a funny one because it is such a bright color typically, so there's a dozen or so colors that you get with Windows Phone, and you can pick one of those to see it throughout the phone. Now, and the Windows Phone OS has done a really good job of using the accent color where it needs to. So, for example, on the start screen, you'll see that a number of the tiles of that color. And as you start to go into some of the pickers, you'll see that some of the highlights that they draw attention to are done in that accent color. Okay. The problem with the accent color is if you've got any branding or strong color palette for your application, chances are the accent color of some description is going to clash with it. So, you might be David who wants magenta, or you might be John who wants blue, and, I pick orange, and, chances are your application is not going to go with those colors, okay? So chances are you're not going to make use of the accent color. You can, and in fact, in Shane's session this morning, I think AU Weather actually makes use of it, okay? The thing you've got to remember about the accent color, it is a bright color, so if you overuse it, it's going to be really glaring and really in the face of the user. So if you're going to make a decision to use it quite sparingly, and use it to draw attention to important things like hyperlinks or click-throughs that the user can take advantage of. And in terms of these colors, you actually got two options. You can actually stick with the default styles. So for example, as you go through and use a text block, you can apply one of the default styles. And the advantage there is it automatically pick up the dark and the light theme. So if you're running in the dark theme, your text is going to be white. If you're running in the light theme, it's going to be black. Okay, so that gives you out-of-the-box support for those dark and light themes. Unfortunately, the second option, which is to basically pick one of those, so pick a dark color or pick a light theme, is actually slightly more problematic, okay? Because out of the box, a lot of the templates and a lot of the styles make the assumption that we've got to support these dark and the light theme. Now, the rules for Marketplace are that your application has to work under both themes. Now, that does not mean that you have to adhere to them. It doesn't mean that you have to support a black theme and a light theme. What it means is if the user runs your application in the light theme, you have to be able to see all the visual elements, okay? That's easier said than done if you go and pick it. There's a couple of options as to how you do this, and what I want to show you is the two options. And actually what we do is we actually combine both of them because they both address slightly different things. So let me flip over to my application. And the first thing I'm going to do, being a good developer, is actually switch over to Blend to do anything to do with design. We should be back in Blend. Now, of course, the next thing I'm going to do is fit back to Visual Studio, but that's beside the point. All right, let me go and create a new resource file, and you'll see why in a couple of minutes. And so this is going to be our default resources. But before I go ahead and create those, what I want to do is just quickly grab a text block and drag it onto here and show you, if you haven't already seen, you can go Edit Style, Apply Resource, and these are some of the default styles you get out of the box with Visual Studio and Blend. Okay, so you can take advantage of these, and you can be sure that they're going to match up with the user's choice of dark or light theme, or even the accent color. So for example, if I pick up the phone text accent style, what you'll see is that the color changes, and actually over on the device change, I can actually see what it's going to look like under different accent themes, okay? Not that it matters, because it's always going to clash with my theme color, and you can never predict exactly what the accent colors are going to be available on the device, because the OEMs actually have the ability to inject an accent color. So you might think, okay, yeah, my app looks great for all of the standard Windows Phone ones, and then orange comes out with a different shade of orange that really clashes with your red. Okay, so let's just go back to here, and we're going to stick with the accent color on this guy. Sorry, while I'm on there, you can also switch the theme, so you can actually see what it looks like in the white theme as well, so you can actually see what your application is going to look like and styled. And actually, this is really good because it means that if I didn't have a style applied to this, you'd actually see that some of these elements actually disappear when we're in the light theme. Out of the box, these elements up here, you'll actually see that if I go down to Edit Style, Apply Resource, you'll actually see that they've already got a style applied to them, which is why they're still visible. If I get rid of that, you'll actually see that those elements will disappear. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to fix this to the dark theme. So I'm going to actually go back to the dark theme, and back here we're going to add one more of these because we're going to come back to it later. Okay. Now, there's a reason why I do this in Blend, is basically if you go add new item in Visual Studio, the resource dictionary is not there. And if you add it, it doesn't add it into the app.xaml, so it doesn't get wired up properly. Actually, Blend, this is one of the few areas where Blend actually does the right thing and wires it up for you. So let me come back to Visual Studio. So you might be saying, okay, well, why have I got 2 resource dictionaries? In fact, most applications that we have or start to work on now have 3. We have a resource dictionary which are going to be all of the standard Windows Phone themes and colors, okay? We'll see that in a minute because I'm going to go and show you where those are located, and I'm going to copy them all into here. I'm going to rename them to default, whatever the resource is called. And the reason I do that is because that's my working mechanism for locking to either the dark theme or the light theme. It means that I've got infinite control over exactly what color and what templates and everything about my app, okay? The other 2 resource files I've got are going to be a colors and brushes one. I'm not going to show that today, but basically the colors and the brushes that I use in my application, I'm going to have in that one file. It just makes them really easy to find. And then the third one is actually a styles and template resource. So basically any styles and templates that I want to use throughout my application. Now, it's not to say if I'm using a particular style or a template just on a single page, I'll leave it on that page because I don't need to put it into the application-wide pool because that just affects my startup speed. Okay, so those things that you're going to share between pages, to get reuse, you can basically put them into these central dictionaries that are going to be available to every single page. Just the caveat there is it does have a small effect on application start time because it's actually got to load all of those resources as your application boots up. So, default resources, let me open that. You'll see that it is just a resource dictionary. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to where the SDK is installed. So you see Microsoft SDKs, Windows Phone, version 8 design. And there's 2 of them here. There's system.windows.xaml. So if I open that, you'll see that there's a bunch of templates and control libraries and stuff like that in there. Okay. So if you've ever wondered where all of those magical templates are stored, this is where they are. Now it's basically an extract out of system.windows. So I'm actually going to go and copy all of those, and I'm just going to drop them into Visual Studio. And then I'm going to go back to File System, and I'm going to do Theme Resources. And so what you'll see here is that these are actually, these colors and brushes are all designed for the dark theme. If you want to switch to the light theme, you can basically make changes to it yourself. So I'm going to drop them all at the top of here. And the only color that's actually not in here, and I'm going to put in here, is actually going to be the accent color. So I'm going to do phone accent color. And I'm going to make that a pink, just like so. So now that I've copied them in here, I'm actually going to rename them. So I'm going to change phone to default. And now the only thing I need to remember is that everywhere through my app, I need to make sure I use the default ones and not the ones that start with phone. Okay, so these will all actually appear in Blend. So if I go across to Blend now, I'll go reload everything, yes. And then if I go edit style, apply styles, you see all my default ones at the top. They don't give you the nice preview, but they are all there for you, okay? So that just gives you infinite control over it, and it's basically replaced all of those standard ones. There are still a couple of caveats to this, and some controls. So for example, if you use the Windows Phone Toolkit, the geniuses that came up with this basically said, okay, for the datetime picker and the list picker, we're going to have a separate page, and it's going to be completely non-stylable, right? So no developer other than us can basically going to style it. And if developers do want to style it, then they can download the entire source and include the entire source of the toolkit in their projects, just so they can style 1 or 2 pages. Not good. The way around that is actually Jeff Wilcox published what he referred to as the theme manager. And essentially what that does, in contrast to copying all of the colors and brushes and templates into your project, what it does is it meticulously goes through them and basically switches the colors to make sure that they're set at the dark or light theme. Now you might be going, okay, well if you're going to do all of that, why did you need to do all of this stuff with resource files? The reason being is that if you go and use the theme manager, there are certain properties, particularly the visibility properties, that he cannot change, okay? So the core ones being phone dark theme visibility and phone light theme visibility, which a bunch of templates actually rely on, he can't change those, okay? They just won't change, okay? He can change all the brushes and the theme and the colors, but he can't change those underlying visibility properties, okay? So you do need to do both if you really want to lock down those colors. So let me go back to Visual Studio, and we're actually going to lock those in now. So we'll go across to NuGet, and we'll go online, and we'll do Theme Manager. And we'll install that. And then in our code, down here. After we've initialized things, we're just going to do theme manager dot go to dark theme and apply it as such. Okay, for some reason my copy and pasting into here didn't bring.
Right at the top, you've got system as a different case. So if you just do undo on those two and go back up to the top line.
Yeah, they shouldn't reply that. They shouldn't require that at all, though. It should be quite typical of Blend to do the wrong thing when I actually want it to do the right thing. Okay, so moving right along, let me just uncomment this, remove these ones. We're going to show Jeff's one, and you've got to take my word for it that copying those in worked. For some reason, I must have done something that I haven't done 1,000 times, and it hasn't worked. Right, so if I then switch across to the light theme, basically it's locked our theme. Okay, so what you typically expect to see in the light theme is that be white with black text. Okay, let's flip back to the slides. Okay, so moving on from the design side of things, as we start to architect our application out, one of the things that everyone talks about in terms of Windows Phone and Windows is the use of MVVM. And there's a lot of stuff out there basically about good practices, bad practices, what you should and what you shouldn't do with MVVM. At the end of the day, if you're doing data binding, you're doing a form of MVVM, okay? Now, how far you take that is up to you. It's a pragmatic decision about, you could data bind literally everything, and you could write behaviors and command binding and all sorts of things so that you never have to see a single line in that code behind file. My approach is very much more pragmatic. It's basically, if it gets the job done, do it. Okay. Basically, if you have to write 10 lines of code to support a click event on a list, you've probably written 10 or 9 lines more than you had to. Okay, you could have double-clicked on the item, wrote a selection changed event handler, and just drilled into your view model. Okay, it's a much quicker approach to doing it. It's not a purist approach, I agree, but it is a very pragmatic and it gets the job done. And you could unit test the hell out of it, and it would still be fine. Okay, so number one about MVVM is it's about data binding, okay? So whether it's your page or your control, essentially what you want is a class that represents the current visual state that you've got there, okay? So using a view model. As you start to use Blend, you'll come across this concept of visual state. So you can imagine a page that is going to load some data, and you're going to have a visual state for when the data is loading. Okay, so you might have like a nice little ticker that goes across the screen, and then once the data is downloaded, then you're going to present the list with the items that you pulled down. Okay, so you've got two states there. You've got loading, and you've got the sort of a loaded state with the data. Okay, now you've actually got a third state that you probably didn't think of initially, which is, and it will come across as you start to go to testing, which is, what do I do when I don't have any data, okay, or I don't have a network signal? Okay, so you've then got a third visual state, okay? Now, one option is that you data bind various attributes of those elements. So you could have a progress indicator with basically a Boolean or a visibility property set to visible or collapsed that you could toggle on and off depending on whether it's in a loading state. And then you could do the same with a list, and then you could have another text box that basically says the network's unavailable. Okay, it's not a great way of designing your application because it means that if you were to hand Blend over to a designer or you're sitting there in front of it yourself, you're going, okay, well, how do I simulate what it looks like when I'm loading a screen? Okay. So that's where visual states come into it. The big challenge with visual states is that there's no support within a view model for bubbling up an event that says move to this state or move to this state. Okay, that's something that's done typically in a code behind file with Visual State Manager.goToState and then passing in the name of the state. Okay, so one of the challenges around MVVM is how you bubble up those state change and how you manage state within your view models. Okay, there's no one solution to this. My mechanism for doing it is literally bubbling an event out of the view model, capturing it in the code behind the page, and basically telling the page to go to a specific state. That works really well, and the one tweak that I make to that is that instead of bubbling up an event with a string in it to say, go to this state, what I do is I have an enumeration with all of the states that I've got, and I bubble the event up with those. Page level, it just does toString on the enumeration. Now, if you're running your code through an obfuscator, make sure you exclude those enumerations, because otherwise you're going to end up trying to go to an obfuscated state. But if you're not obfuscating, that's fine. Okay, so that's one mechanism, and the advantage there is that the only alignment you need to do is make sure that your enumeration values actually align with your visual states in Blend and what you've called them. Okay, but you've only got one thing to maintain, as opposed to if you have 15 different visual state changes, you don't have to go through each one of those and make sure that they've got the correct state name in them. The other challenge is, okay, well, and I spoke to this a little bit ago, is basically what happens when UI events are raised from the controls, okay? You do have two options, or a couple of different options. You can go down the command binding option, okay, so you can have, extra code in your view model to basically support some form of binding. My approach is very pragmatic. It's basically, you have an event handler, it raises an event, you call into the appropriate method on your view model and pass in any data. Now, the other thing that you then need to start thinking about is, okay, well, I don't want to be doing all of these service requests in my view model, or I don't want to be doing all my database access requests from my view model, because the problem there is that you don't get any reuse out of that. Okay, sure, you could have a base view model and then you could inherit from those, but it kind of gets very messy and very clunky around doing that. So one of the strategies around there is basically you have this concept of a repository. People call it all sorts of things, but it's basically this one sort of thing that gets shared between the view models. Basically, as you instantiate your view model, it gets an instance of this repository, so it's almost like a singleton throughout your application, and that's going to be used for accessing your local storage, so isolated storage, and it will also be used for connect to your services. The other challenge that you might have is, okay, well, what happens when my view model does a bunch of work and it then needs to send the user off to a different page? Okay, so you might get to the end of a form and the user clicks save or send, and your view model goes and calculates a bunch of things and works out and validates fields and stuff like that. It gets to the end and goes, okay, that's all good. Let's go to the start page, or let's go to the this XYZ page. Like, well, firstly, your view model now needs to understand what page it's going to go to, right? Rather than just saying, I'm done, it basically says, okay, well, the user's actually got to go to this page, or it's got to go to this state, okay? So that's number one problem. The number two problem is that in order to do that state change, it's actually got to reach back into the UI layer and say, okay, well, the UI object, go to this page, okay? Because the navigation events are on either the frame or on the page, okay? So the frame, basically, you can do frame.navigate, or on the page, it's navigation service.navigate. Okay, so again, you need a strategy for handling that. My mechanism for doing that is actually each one of my view models actually gets an iNavigator. Okay, and the iNavigator is platform specific, so this code works across different platforms, and each platform actually has a different implementation of iNavigator. Okay, and so when your app starts up, you create an instance of this iNavigator and you pass it into your view models. And literally, in most cases for Windows Phone and Windows 8, the iNavigator, all it does is navigation service.navigate. Okay. There are some differences between Windows 8 and Windows Phone. For example, Windows Phone, you navigate by URL. Windows 8, navigation by type. Now, Windows Phone implementation of that iNavigator is really, really easy. In fact, all it does is it navigates to the view model. You basically pass it in the view model that you actually want to navigate to. Like, you literally pass in the type of view model, okay? Behind the scenes, all we do is toString on that, and actually in our app.xaml, we do a URI mapper that actually redirects it to the appropriate page. Windows 8's a little harder because you're passing in the type of a view model, and you actually need the type of the page that you want to get to. Okay, so but again, it's not particularly rocket science, and type.getType will actually if you do some permutation on the naming convention there, you can go from a view model name through to your page name. Okay. Okay, so when we're thinking about this, this should carry through to your solution structure. Okay, so obviously you've got your yep.
If you have a view model shared to different pages.
Don't. Okay, so this gets to my, actually on the next slide I'll talk a little bit about the life cycle of a view model and how I see it set. So the question for everyone else's benefit was, if I have a view model that it works across 2 pages, or is it used by 2 pages? And my response immediately was don't, okay? View models are so closely tied to a page or to a particular user control that they should only be used for those. I mean, they literally should be representing the visual state of that page, or what's currently been displayed on that page, okay? I'm not saying you're wrong if you do it the other way, because everyone's to their own. I'm just saying it becomes a bit problematic because you then got to work, okay, well, am I on this page or this page? Whereas if you have a very close alignment between your page and your view model, it becomes super simple. And the advantage there is if somebody else comes into your project team and you have to introduce the model to them, and then you say, oh, but hang on, this view model works with these 2 pages and this one and this one and this. And they're going, okay, yep. Whereas if you say, right, if you're going to create a new page, create a new view model, you're done, okay? Simple. The simpler you keep it, the easier it gets. Okay.
Yeah, just a bit disagreement with that. Isn't that the same as code behind that? One binding one, then the view model is supposed to be able to use multiple places where the same.
No, the view model is never really supposed to be used across multiple places. The point is that you're pulling apart the visual state of your page so that you can then test it. Okay, so this is one of the biggest advantages of actually having that separation is that you've got no binding on your UI to those, to the point where your view model actually shouldn't be exposing things like visibility properties. It should be exposing a Boolean value to say whether something's true or false, and then you should use some sort of converter, okay? Because that gives you that separation. It means that you've got no dependencies actually on the visual part of Windows Phone, Windows 8, whatever other platform you want to support. And this is where portable class libraries come into, okay? Because as soon as you think along those lines about this complete separation of constructs, all of a sudden you can make use of portable class libraries, okay? One of my biggest criticisms of portable class libraries when they first came out, no visibility property. I do data binding to visibility property all the time. It says like, and then as I start to think about things, okay, where am I using visibility properties? Oh, I'm using it to hide and show things. And my designer, who I work with all the time, has been saying, can you not data bind to visibility? Because it's a real pain for me to simulate, okay? Because in Blend, you have to literally go and manually turn that property on and off, and then you need to remember to data bind it back up again. Whereas if you actually use visual states for that, you've changed your way of thinking. It's now easier for the designer. It's easier for you because you've now got that complete separation. What you've got is now testable, and it works on other platforms. So you don't have that dependencies back on the visibility property, which is only really Windows and Windows Phone, okay? Virtually every other platform on the face of the planet has a Boolean, right? So, okay, so testing. I mentioned that there is a Windows Phone unit testing app. Feel free to use that. The biggest issue I see with it, and I haven't worked out how to fix this, and if you do know the answer to this, please let me know, is that I haven't been able to get any of the test cases that I use in this testing app to actually work in the cloud. So we'll talk about binding to TFS in a minute. The advantage is that actually all of my code is actually in the portable class, like all the business logic and all my code that I really want to be testing is actually in my portable class library. It's portable for a reason. It means that my unit testing project, I can just pick up a vanilla unit testing project and test my portable class library, okay? And that does work in the cloud, okay? A little bit of a drill down into data binding. Some of the things that you should be aware of. There is a mode when it comes to data binding. Yep. Yep. So what are the limitations around the portable class library that you found in terms of binding? So the issues that you're likely to see there are more related to do with Prism and the validation stuff rather than necessarily just data binding. Data binding really relies on one or two interfaces. Primarily iNotify property changed, and that's available in PCLs. And then the other one is iNotify collection changed, which is collection modification. Those ones are supported so that those ones you can actually have in your model and your view model, and you can have all of that stuff in your portable class library. Absolutely. Well, again, it's one of those purists. I would say no, it's not a bad thing. I mean, in a lot of our code, we have a very fine. It's hard to work out where the view model ends and the model starts. My view is that model is really anything that you're getting back from a service or that you're using for data access is basically so those entities. But even so, there's a kind of a grey line there about, okay, well, do those entities have methods on them? Do you have any properties that modify the other properties? And all of a sudden, there's a little bit of a grey line there, even so. But that's, I mean, so I don't actually make a distinction. I don't have a folder called models. I have a folder called entities, and I usually have entities that I'm using for serialization or for data storage. I have those in there. But the border between what's a view model and what's a model is a bit grey, okay? So in terms of data binding, there are 3 modes. Out of the box, as you drag stuff onto using Blend, typically you will just get one-way binding. Sometimes Blend decides to be creative and put one time in there, but most of the time it just makes the default. So the default binding is one way. Essentially that means that your code, your underlying view model, if it has changes, those will get reflected in the UI. Two-way is if you've got elements that you want to take user input and that you want those to cascade or flow down into your view model. Okay. Now, regular code doesn't automatically bubble up change events. Okay, so as you change your class, your view model, you make changes to that. There's nothing sitting there or actively monitoring it. Okay, because out of the box, if you modify a property, you've modified that property. You haven't told anybody you've modified that property. You've just modified that property. So you need to implement iNotify property changed, and as part of that, it exposes a property changed event. And every time you change a property, you need to raise that property changed event so that the UI knows that it's changed. It will requery it, and then it will go and update any properties that are automatically bound to that. Okay. Unfortunately, that adds quite a lot of overhead in terms of the amount of code that you have to write. Okay, so one of the things I'm going to show you is this. It's a NuGet package called Fody that basically has it basically weaves in property changed event. Now, I must confess, we are not currently using this. I am probably going to roll it into our team, whether they like it kicking or screaming. The challenge is that you've got to educate the team as to why you should use it, and there's a couple of little gotchas around it, and we'll see those in terms of IntelliSense and automatic completion. Because it's weaving these attributes in as part of the build process. Basically, it builds the library, it then goes and weaves this stuff into the IL. Okay, so, oh, we got one more. Okay, we'll talk about instancing. So view models, there's a couple of different models in terms of how you instance your view models. If you take the MVVM light approach, they pretty much say that there's going to be a single, each view model is a singleton, and it gets reused within every time you use the same page, right? So if I go page 1, page 2, another instance of page 1, I'm actually going to get the same instance of that view model connecting to both of them. And so my stance on that is that it's a little messy and it's not as clean as if I have one page, one view model. I get to the next page, it's another instance of the same page, but it has its own discrete view model. Now, if you go and look at the way that the phone stack works, if you look at the state dictionaries that are associated with each page, so for transient persistence, those are packaged with per page, okay? So it makes sense to me that the view models are done per page. Again, there's no right or wrong to this, just one preference over another, okay? So my view models are very closely aligned to the life cycle of the page or the user control that they're using, that they're being data bound to. Now, I mentioned that you have these potentially repository and iNavigator that are going to be sort of almost singletons throughout your application. And that yields a little bit of a problem as you go to construct your view models, okay? So there's a number of ways that you can construct your view model. Your constructor of your page, you can create your view model and wire it up there. On Loaded or on Navigator 2, you can create an instance of your view model and go and wire it up there. The problem there is that you're going to need references to those singletons for the repository and the iNavigator. Okay, so you need to work out how you're going to wire that in, and sure, you could write that 5 lines of code on every single page. I'd argue that there's a slightly better way. So I use this locator pattern, and basically I have a singleton that is called the view model locator. I create an instance of that as my application starts up. In fact, I create it in XAML, okay? And then I create the instances of my main pages by referencing properties on that locator. So hopefully we get through that as part of this demo. Right, so let me flip back to Visual Studio in my main page. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a new class library. So new project, portable. So this is going to be my core library. And for the time being, I'm actually going to select phone 8. For those who have dealt with portable class libraries, you'll know why I've selected phone 8. It just makes my life easier. Basically, the way portable class libraries work is that they have a different profile associated with them depending on what options you select there, and they basically allow you to access different API sets. Right, so in my core library, I'm going to add a folder called View Models. If I could spell models correctly. So this is going to be my main view model. And I'm going to have a single method in here, which is test text. It's really original. I'm going to flip back to my main page, and this is one way that you can actually instantiate your view models. And this is really, really demo stuff. And notice this is the beauty of ReSharper. Notice I haven't done add reference or add using statements. It's gone add a reference to core and use the view model. So this stuff almost sold me on ReSharper. I mean, I forked out for the entire team just because, you know, I just saw it saving so much time. Okay, so that's created me an instance of my view model. Okay, it's done it in XAML. Okay, the advantage of XAML is it means that it can be used by Blend. Okay, Blend understands what you write in XAML. One hidden thing about XAML is that most people don't realize it's just declarative marking up a class. Okay, all it's doing is saying, create me an instance of this class. Okay, it does a bunch of other wizardry stuff, but the raw thing, if you put a resource there, you can create whatever class you like. Okay, I haven't made this a dependable object or anything like that. It's just a class. Okay, so the other thing I'm going to do is I'm then going to set that as the data context of my page. Source, static resource, view model. Okay. I'm just going to check that it still runs. Okay, it does. And obviously it's got no visual effect on there because I haven't data bound it to anything, but behind the scenes it's gone to actually create an instance of those and it's wired it up as the data context. Let me flip across to Blend. It's going to say, yes, do you want to reload? And hopefully what we should see is that as I drill into here, it would help if I actually opened the right page, Nick. There you go. Data context, you can actually see that it's picked up the fact that I'm creating those in XAML. It said, okay, the data context for your page is test text, and you can then drag that across over to there, and it's going to create a text block, and of course it's not going to size properly because I've got no content in it. So let me just actually undo that one. What I'm going to do is instead, I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to change the layout of this to a stack panel, so things stack vertically. I'm then going to go to assets. I'm going to grab a text block, drop that into there. I'm going to grab a text box and drop that into there. And I'm going to drag these both onto there. Okay, so in theory, what we should see now is, we'll go and have a quick look at the code that is generated. Okay, you'll see that the text block has got a one-way binding. Okay, so it's just the test text. The text box has got a two-way binding. Okay, so it should be able to enter stuff, and it should update that property, which means that both the text block and the text box should have the same content. How many people guess that this is not going to work? All right, good. I'm glad people are awake. Okay, so let me type into there. And sure enough, it does nothing. Okay. The reason for that is because, as I just mentioned, my view model is just that. It's just a plain class. Okay. I've got no raising of events. If I update that property, which it has been updating as I type the text in there, no one knows that. It's like, you know, going into a silent room and yelling or something, whatever the analogy is. Okay. So in order to bubble that up, I need the iNotify property changed, and I'll implement that, and so essentially, the implementation is actually just this property changed, and then ReSharper nicely added the rest for me. I'm going to create a backing field on there, and the reason for that is because I then want to do on property changed in here, and I'm going to pass it in test text, and I'm going to type the string painfully into there, making sure I get it right, and then I'm going to run this. Okay, so hopefully now, as we type, boom, okay, it's updating. Okay, so it's doing the right thing. That's a lot of code, and man, if I had to do that for every single property, it's going to be a lot of code. Now, there's a couple of strategies that I use already, which is use a snippet. Okay, so as I type, I actually don't use, I do have it here. I actually don't use on property change, I use raise property change, but you can see that by typing BMP, it's generated that code for me. I can then go and tab through it and change the type and the variable name, stuff like that. Okay, so that's one strategy. The strategy I'm just going to show you very quickly is I'm going to undo all of this code back to the point where I had a property, and I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to go back to NuGet. I'm going to look up Fody, and I'm going to go. You could do it in two steps, so you can install Fody, and then you can install propertychange.fody, but there's a dependency on them, so if you just pick the second one. There are actually a number of other extensions that you can get for Fody as well for doing other weaving if you want, but for my purposes, I want the property changed, and I'm going to come into here and I'm going to go implements property change. And I'm going to run that. Boom. Okay, one attribute. Okay, it's pretty sweet. I actually really liked that when I found it. All right. Now, in the essence of time, what I'm going to do is actually skip the view model locator part, and we'll come back to that towards the end if we end up with time. Essentially, the view model is model locator. Singleton object, you create it in the same way as I just created the view model locator, but you create it in the app.xaml, and then you expose a property on there called main, and then you data bind that up the same way as I bound up the data context in the main page. I'll make this code available after the session so that you can take a look at what I would have done, time permitting. Okay. Okay, how many people use some form of a source control system? Good, that's higher than I expected. For those who might have had bad experience with TFS and you'd be going, boo, okay, TFS in the cloud is actually quite a lovely experience, and you have options, okay? They don't insist that you use the TFS approach for source control. You can actually back it onto Git, and actually, if you're going to do it and you're going to spend a lot of time in Blend, I would highly recommend that you use the Git approach. The reason being is that every time you switch to Blend, Blend will go off to TFS and say, are you connected? And you go, yes, I'm still connected. So you have to wait for a few seconds. But if you go down the Git path, it basically it doesn't assume that you're connected all the time, so it doesn't actually go and check. Okay, so there's just a slight performance benefit for doing the Git approach. The downside is that when you go to commit stuff in, you then need to do two stages. You need to commit, and then you need to sync. Whereas if you just commit into TFS, it will commit the whole lot. Okay. You also get project and team management out of the box. Okay, so for my team, we actually use TFS in the cloud, and we use all our work items and tracking and stuff like that. So virtually every time I have an idea, I'll go into TFS in the cloud, go create a new project, okay, and I'll assign people to the team and all that project management stuff. It's awesome. You also get builds, so automated builds. This is particularly cute, except when it doesn't work. Okay, so unfortunately around Windows and Windows Phone, if you start to use things like the Bing Map SDK or you use the SQLite extension, unfortunately, they haven't installed those onto the build servers yet, so they still cause some issues, which would probably be why my tests are failing. And lastly, of course, you've got tests. Okay, now, actually, there's two different types of tests. There's tests in terms of defining test cases and getting those to run, but then there's also unit testing support within the automated builds. Okay, so what we're going to show you just quickly is my project that I've just been working on. I'm going to attach it into TFS. So I'm going to go to Team Explorer. Now, I did a little bit of a dodgy trick. Okay, I actually placed my new project actually into the subfolder of the Git repository. So actually what's going to happen is when I go to changes, it's actually going to pick up this project as a change set. So I'm going to go, yep, adding TechEd demo, and I'm going to go commit that. And it goes, oh, wow, that was quick. Okay, the time-consuming part is when you go and sync. Okay, so it's actually going to sync that to the cloud. And hopefully we're done, assuming I don't have any conflicts. Right, the other thing I want to show you is the builds. Okay, so now that I've checked that stuff in, I can actually go ahead and build it. And so you'll see that I've got a whole bunch of test builds. I've run this demo a few times in the past. So I'm going to go new build definition. And it's going to go TechEd demo build. And you'll notice that it immediately starts to flag things that I need to address. So if I go to project, or process, this is one area where if you actually use the native support for source control, when you get to this step, it's actually pre-populated with your solution name and project and stuff like that. Unfortunately, when you use the Git approach, it doesn't actually pick that stuff up. Luckily, it's actually relatively easy to configure. So TechEd WP demo .solution. And the configuration I want to build is the release. And platform is x86. Now, the reason I'm picking x86 is because in theory, I want to build and run it on the emulator. Now, that was because I wanted to run the test cases. In actual fact, it doesn't matter which platform you build because if you can't get the test cases to run. What does matter is down here at the MS Build platform, you do need to pick x86, otherwise it won't build the phone with the phone SDK. Okay. So I'll go ahead and save that. Okay. And then I'll come over here and I will queue a new build. And we'll come back towards the end of the session and check whether my build was successful or not. Okay, that's it. It was really simple to do from Visual Studio. Now, if you flip over to the web browser, you can actually go through and actually interrogate all of that stuff. So all your change sets are online. All of your tasks are all there. You can do associations between all of those activities and your task system as part of setting up all that stuff. The nice thing is that these tasks, these things that have come across as failed builds, are now all actually tasks for me to go and fix. Okay, which is good and bad. It means that if you've got a build that goes every half an hour and it's continually failing, it gets really, really annoying when you have to go through and go, yeah, done, yep, done, yep, done, yep, done. Okay, but luckily it assigns it to the person who broke the build, which is awesome for a team. Okay, so let's flip back to here. So I've checked my code. Okay, third-party libraries. I would encourage you to grab the Windows Phone Toolkit. If you're using a list within your application, or if you have any element that is not a button and you are going to make it clickable, you should be using the tilt effect. Okay, tilt effect applies on two controls out of the box. It applies to lists and list items. Okay, so if you apply it like I've done there, so toolkit tilt effect is tilt effect enabled equal true. That's going to apply it to each item within the list. Alternatively, if you actually go into the item template for that list, so the template that defines how each item is going to look like, you can actually apply the tilt effect to the item template. It doesn't matter, it does the same thing. Okay. Behind the scenes, what it actually does is it goes looking for the list box item, and it actually applies the tilt effect to that item. The other thing it applies to is the hyperlink button. Okay, so if you apply the tilt effect to a hyperlink button, it will actually tilt as well. It doesn't out of the box apply to anything else. Okay, now you can apply it to a grid, and you can then apply it to any grid or any item. I would highly recommend that you don't do that. Okay, because you're going to start to see some weird visual effects, because every grid that you then have, for example, within an item template, is now also got the tilt effect applied to it. So you've got the tilt effect on the item template and on the grid inside, so you end up with a double tilt effect. Okay, so you just got to be a little bit careful about extending the tilt effect to actually support those other things. Okay, so highly recommend if you're going to apply it, you apply it to a hyperlink button, and you style the hyperlink button to look like whatever you want it to be, or you use it on a list. The other thing that you get out of the box with Windows Phone Toolkit, amongst other things, is page transitions. Okay, the number of times that I've seen people copy these page transitions that are down here and apply them in every single page that they have. Okay, don't do that. Okay, you don't need to regenerate your code every time, because for two reasons. Firstly, it means that you've got a bunch of XAML that you don't need because you've duplicated it everywhere. Second of all, if you have to change them, you have to change them everywhere. Okay, you're better off defining a page style like I've done here, and you'll notice that I've actually pulled out a whole bunch of other things other than just the transitions. I've also put default font family, font size, foreground, the system tray, whether it's visible or not, the opacity, foreground color, supported orientations. So basically a whole bunch of guff that you see at the top of main page. So you'll see it at the top of here. Basically, it gets rid of these lines here. So virtually on every page, I can now delete code, okay? And literally all I'm going to be doing is replacing it with style, static resource, what was it called? Page, I haven't imported it, so something like that. Okay, so basically that one line gets rid of all of that, and it applies the transitions. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, hang on, why didn't you make it a default one or an implicit style? It doesn't work on pages for some reason. Okay, so if you basically get rid of on here, you'll see that there's actually a name on there. So if I was to get rid of the key on there, okay, in theory that should make it an implicit style, so it should be applied to every page. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work on pages. Okay, so you do need to name it, and you do need to set it in your code. Let me get rid of that. For the time.
Same way to use a Windows Store app, isn't it?
Sorry.
For Windows Store app, you can use the same concept.
So for Windows.
Windows Store app.
Yep. Okay, let's go back to here. Okay, I do make a call out to MVVM Lite. There are some good parts about MVVM Lite, even though I don't use it. Notification, so you basically have a publish subscribe model, so if you need to notify through pages and view models and things like that, you can use that. Most of the time, because the reason that they need this is because they've gone the singleton path with the view models. My process of actually having pages with view models basically means that I very rarely need to pass notification between them, because literally all you do is when you get back to a certain page, you just check to see whether you've got to update data, versus if you've got a singleton, then you basically need to react to certain things that are going on other places in your app. The other framework that I point out is the MVVM Cross. If you're doing cross-platform stuff, I'd highly recommend you take a look at that. Basically, the intent is to try and use MVVM across other platforms. So they do impose some sort of navigation framework as part of that. The other nice thing that they're working on is actually some really nice stuff around data binding, particularly for those other platforms that we shall not name. Okay. So I'm going to skip the toolkit demo because you've seen that. Okay, some control libraries. So the Windows Phone SDK now actually includes the panorama pivot and long list selector. If you're still using a list box in a Windows Phone 8 project, please don't. Okay. If you're generating these in Blend, so you're dragging some data across and it generates a list box, you basically need to switch it across to the long list selector. Long list selector has two modes. It has the jump list style, so you can see here over on the right-hand side, that's what I mean by the jump list. So you basically have those grouped items. You click on the group and you get that jump list style. And that jump list, again, could be a grid or it could be a list. That's one mode of operation for the long list selector. The default is actually for the long list selector to basically behave the same as a list box. The reason why you should be using that is it's actually been more optimized than the list box has. Okay. Yep.
Does that fix the issue where list box, unless you set the exact height, you couldn't actually scroll to the bottom of it if you had like 25 items?
That's never been an issue.
Because sometimes it doesn't let you scroll down properly.
That's generally because you've got something either sitting at the bottom or the top that's actually preventing it from scrolling to the bottom. The list box has always behaved correctly in terms of item templates. You'll always be able to see the last one. Typically, it's because you've got it nested in some sort of stack panel. And to be honest, I see this mostly when I let designers loose writing XAML, because they love to position things using stack panels. So they think, oh yeah, it's going down the screen, I'm going to use a stack panel. Problem with a vertical stack panel is there's no end to it. So unless you fix height the list box, it's just going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. So you fixed height it, and then all of a sudden when your screen size changes, and you go, oh, hang on, I've got this blank space on the 720. It's like, yeah, okay. So yeah, typically that's because you need to use a grid for those alignments. Come grab me afterwards if you want to have a look at, and I'll walk through and we'll try and work out what the issue is there. Normally I don't make a big deal about third-party component libraries because I just view that most of the stuff I can do with out of the box with a combination of list box and some panoramas and pivots. Increasingly, particularly as I start to do some more work in the enterprise, I'm going to need graphs and charts and all of those extra bits, and they're too hard to write yourself. Okay, so don't bother. There are some really good control vendors out there. Infogestics, Telerik, which I've got the guys here, Syncfusion and Component One. I'll make a call out as well. With that said, I would like to bring on Dave Varela, and we'll make this quick switch. What are you? You're 2, aren't you?
8.
You're 8. Okay.
And I realised I forgot to plug it in my laptop. Yeah, so Bristow will know. So for some reason, this model laptop, if you don't have it plugged into power, it goes down to like 20% of its speed for some reason. There we go. Can you hear me or? Yeah. Can you hear me now? No? Testing? Testing?
Is it on?
Not on? I can yell very loudly. So the control that I'm going to be showing today is the list box, the list control. So in the... It's on. I can talk a bit quieter. So in the TechEd Australia application, I use this control in it. So I was able to throw out a whole bunch of code that was there before because the control just does it all for me. With Infogestics, we just say everything should be sexy by default. So we make things look nice. So in the TechEd app, we can go type in stuff, it automatically searches. I should have searched for something that's actually there. You can also go and search, look at everything by schedule. So you can click it, scroll down, pick the time slot that you want, and we'll auto do it, take you there. So to show you how quick it is to do that, I've got 60 seconds left. In this demo, it's a really good business app. I'm showing you Pokemon. And I'll scroll, I don't have a mouse, I can't zoom. There we go. So my Pokemon just has its Pokedex ID, its Pokemon name, and its type. So my code for this, scroll. We've just got you can hold it for me? Teamwork. So I'm just newing up a list of Pokemons. We've got Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, etc. So to whack this in, we're just going to go IG ZAM list to get it in there. Now Nick was showing you how to do the data bindings. So it's just going to be item source equals binding So we're binding to my Pokemons. And just to give it a hint, we're telling it that it should display the name. So if we hit F5 on that, it's going to build it. Straight away, we can see our Pokemon. So without having to do anything, we can already search. So we can search for the source. So it's going to bring them all up. So all of that's just happening by default. And we can make it look even sexier by just copying in this element into it. So that's just going to enable grouping. We hit F5. Now we're going to go and sort those Pokemon by the type. So now we can click on it, scroll straight down to all the water type Pokemon. Cool. And so the last thing is, so Nick was talking about portable class libraries and MVVM cross. So these are the controls for Windows Phone. So if you are using Xamarin and MVVM cross and portable class libraries, we have controls on iPhone and Android also. Dirty words here, but we help you with that cross-platform stuff. I passed on to John.
Thanks a lot. What number are you? 7? Just switch over. Cool. Thanks. I realize that it's getting near the end of the day. Hi, I'm John. I work for Telerik. We have controls as well. We have a list box as well.
Hey, I want to show a list box.
I won't show a list box because I didn't want to, clash or anything like that. Your mouse is, and we don't have Pokemon. Yes, we have other things. So we have a variety of controls. We have over 60 controls in RAD controls for Windows Phone, Windows 7, Windows Phone 8, as well as cloud-enabled controls. These sell for $99, but if you're part of the Nokia Premier Developer Program, you get them for free. Some of the controls that are worth mentioning, we've just recently added some image editing controls. I won't show you the list box control because that's what Dave showed. We have some nice gauges and charts and things like that. I'm not going to bore you with the markup right now, but just give you an idea of what these things look like, get a sense of how pretty they are, the pretty pixels. You can download this app and try it out yourself. Last one I'll leave you with is the looping list. This one's kind of fun. Yeah, all kinds of great stuff. So anyways, I'm here at TechEd. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up, blah, 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 etc. Yeah, sorry, list box, damn it. All right, there you go. I broke the rule. All right, well, thanks a lot. Cheers.
You stuck that one in, didn't you? Yes. All right, thanks, guys. All right. Okay, so let's get to running your app. Okay, most of us are either running on a real device or the emulator. There's a couple of little things to know about the emulator. If you didn't already realize this, it actually comes pre-populated with a bunch of sample data, particularly sample photos. One of the gotchas around this is if you try and use those sample photos from within your app, so for example, you use the photo picker, it's going to come back with no photos, and you're just going to go, I could have sworn that I saw a demo where they picked a sample set of photos. The reason for that is you've got to go into the Photos Hub. If you go into the Photos Hub, those pictures magically appear, and then you can use them from in your app. There you go, if you didn't already realize that. Okay, resizing and reorientating the emulator. It does support those along the side. There are emulators for all of the different resolutions for the phones. I highly recommend you test on those. To be honest, what I would encourage you to do is if you're building phone apps, then you should get a 720p device. Okay, I know you need to spend money to buy that. But the other thing you should get is a low-end device. Okay, the 520 is a really good option for that. It's like $170 from Harvey Norman, no contract, no nothing. It's worth testing on those, particularly if you've got a lot of animations or visual effects in your app, because you may want to disable those on those platforms. If you're building games, you may actually want to exclude those so that you get through Marketplace Cert, because they'll test it on those, and if they don't perform well, particularly for games, they'll actually fail you on those. Okay, so if you're doing game development, go and talk to Vaughan, because he knows all about that. The additional tool windows, I'm still finding that people don't know that this exists. Basically, there's a right arrow on the emulator that basically ejects this additional tool windows. And there you can play around with the accelerometer, so that little orange dot, you can drag that around and change the orientation of your device. That's not as effective as dropping your phone, but it's a pretty good simulator. The location, you can simulate the location of your device. Now, there's some gotchas with the location stuff within the emulator. The workaround that I've found for it not just working is that if you go into the Maps app on the emulator, all of a sudden the location starts to work magically on the emulator. For some reason, if you don't go into the Maps app, or you haven't been into the Maps app every once in a while, the location just stops working, and I've got no idea why. And despite lots of requests to the team, they haven't fixed it. Screenshots. Okay, so you can take a screenshot from the third tab there of the emulator. It's a really good way of capturing those screenshots that you required for Marketplace. Okay, just don't forget to just remove the debugger. So just run your app up, stop the debugger, run your app from the start screen. The reason being is that by default, the debugger puts those frame rate counters on the right-hand side. If you submit an app, your app could be the best app in the world, but if you've got those frame rate counters, they will fail you straight away. Okay. And lastly, network. And you think, and you go to this network tab and you think, okay, well, I should be able to configure the network. Beep. Okay, the network tab is there for one reason, to basically tell you if you have a network connection. If you get an address that starts along the lines of 169, that basically tells you that you don't have an address, okay? Time to either reboot your machine or close the emulator, restart it. Now, unfortunately, there are a number of known issues to do with the emulator not picking up networks. It should pick up the same network that your computer is on, so it actually does have its own network address. I have two wireless networks at home. It picks up the top, the one upstairs. Fine, no problems. Go downstairs. It's exactly the same configuration, same unit, same everything. Doesn't pick up the network downstairs. And my machine works fine, just the emulator won't get an address. So there's some quirky stuff going on there for sure. The other thing people aren't aware of is that there is this new simulation dashboard, and it's really good for simulating network connections because your emulator is actually on this big pipe called your host machine. Okay, it's hosted through Hyper-V, and so this simulation dashboard basically allows you to control the speed and the variability of your network, as well as doing things like triggering the lock screen, and that's useful for, firstly, if you're doing any sort of work around the lock screen. Then this is a particularly good one because you can actually see what the lock screen's like without having to have a physical device. Okay, debugging. So just a point here for those people who are still stuck in iOS land or Android land, we have awesome debugging capabilities, okay? Try doing this stuff in Xcode, try putting conditional breakpoints and drilling down into object models, beep all. Okay, it's super easy in Visual Studio for those people who know it. If you're going to do logging, there's a couple of good logging providers out there. These are two that I found. I must admit I don't use them regularly, but they're both paid services. Unified Logger and BugSense, they're basically the code to integrate them is like one or two lines of code, plus a NuGet package. You go and register online, and they give you some really good metrics about logging statements and stuff like that. It's all cloud-based. You don't need to be online to log stuff, so basically your app can work quite happily offline, and then when it goes back online, it sends the log reports off. I'd also recommend you look at both IsoSource Spy and Windows Phone Power Tools. These are really good for drilling into isolated storage. So it means that you can pull out files and check that you're reading and writing the right files. The phone power tools are actually getting pretty awesome because they've actually got some performance analysis stuff in there as well. So that's worth taking a look at too. UAT testing, there's a couple of options here in terms of actually providing your apps out to third parties for testing. You can sideload them, means you need to develop or unlock the phone. That's become a whole bunch easier now that individuals who are not registered with Marketplace can actually unload up to, I think it's 1 or 2 devices. You can go through the beta testing route, so you can actually go through the Marketplace and actually register to beta test. So you submit your Zap in the same way as you would to submit it for certification, but they don't do a certification pass. They basically just publish it on their CDN so that third parties can download, or so your beta testers, and you need to provide the live IDs for those, can actually deploy them to their device and actually test them. There's a third mechanism which uses enterprise deployment. So I mentioned these two tools. If you go to Windows, the Windows 8 store, there's an app called the Windows Phone App Manager. You can basically upload your Zap. It will sign it and give you the signed version back, and along with a certificate. And you can use those to deploy it using the enterprise deployment path. You basically install the cert, and then you install the Zap, and you bypass the store. There is also a product coming from us called Build It Beta. More information coming. If you're interested in doing or finding out more about that, come and see me afterwards. We've got a beta program for Build It Beta coming up. Analytics, there's again a couple of frameworks out there. Google Analytics, Omniture, Flurry, they all have SDKs for Windows Phone, which is good to see. Push notifications are a big area of where people are innovating. Microsoft out of the box give you a lot of the fundamentals for actually creating the channel between Microsoft and the devices. So if you have their channel URL, you can send them messages. The biggest problem there is that you need some sort of cloud service to aggregate all of those devices that you've now got connected, so that when you say, I want to send a broadcast message out to all these devices, you now have a list of them. And that's where these products from Urban Airship, Push.io, Buddy, Windows Azure Mobile Services, so the notification bus stuff, all comes into play to allow you to do those broadcast operations and actually track those users over time.
And Friday, 8 a.m. I'll be talking at Azure Notification Hubs.
I was going to say, yes, I heard you mention that earlier today. So, yeah, Dave's session on, was it Friday morning? Nice. I'm not sure I'd bypass the party to go to that. Okay, yeah, failing that, look online. Lastly, social authentication. So basically, if you need to authenticate a user, unless you're building a sort of an enterprise-style application, you should consider using the Windows Azure Mobile Services, so WAMs. And over there, you can see a screenshot of basically you go and register for Windows Live, Facebook, Twitter, Google ID, and you basically put your keys into there, and then you write like 3 lines of code within your application to basically authenticate the user using one or more of those. So typically a lot of the apps that we're building now, we actually register all 4 of them. We provide the user with the option of what credentials they want to sign in with, and essentially you get a token back from that process, and then you can use that to access the various information on those networks. So typically I'd go and pull the profile photo and they'd use their display name and stuff like that. Facebook SDK, if you want to do just Facebook stuff, is really good because it's built out to support all the operations there. Otherwise, you can do the native OAuth operations yourself and across any of the OAuth providers. So Twitter, Facebook, all of those have a mechanism to do OAuth today. It basically means you've got to host the web browser, and then you redirect them to the authentication site. And lastly, the Live SDK and SkyDrive for doing Microsoft-centric stuff. Now, there are some gotchas to do with Phone 7 and upgrading to Phone 8. They've changed the SDK and it's not backward compatible because it doesn't work with portable class libraries and stuff. Basically, the Windows Live team didn't really understand about portable class libraries when they wrote it. If you want to do that stuff but you don't explicitly need any support for SkyDrive, I'd highly recommend you look at the Windows Azure Mobile Services stuff. They do have a free offering at the moment, so it's basically a 20 megabyte database coupled with all of the Windows Mobile Services. There are some limitations on the number of messages you can pass and stuff like that, but it's a great opportunity to actually get started with all of that stuff without having to cough up some money. And that is my time. So unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions, so hopefully you don't have any. But I'm going to hang around for a few minutes anyhow, so feel free to just yell out questions and I can answer them. Thanks, guys.